Why does it still surprise people when someone says, "I don't want to get married"? Not, "I can't," not, "I failed to," just, "don't want to." There's often an awkward pause after that sentence. Someone laughs like it's a joke. Someone says, "You'll change your mind." Someone asks, "What happened?" As if the absence of marriage must be explained by trauma, fear, or immaturity. But psychologically, not wanting to get married isn't a flaw. It's a response to culture, to experience, to observation, to self-knowledge. And the biggest mistake people make is assuming that everyone is wired to want the same life structure. Marriage isn't just a relationship, it's an institution, and some minds question institutions more than others. To understand people who don't want to get married, you don't start with romance. You start with how they understand autonomy. For many people, marriage represents stability, a promise, a shared future, a safety net. For others, it represents permanence, and permanence can feel heavy to certain nervous systems, not because they fear commitment, but because they value flexibility. People who don't want to get married often have a strong sense of self-direction. They are deeply aware of how they function when alone. They know their rhythms, their emotional cycles, their need for space. Marriage, in its traditional form, can feel like a structure that assumes constant merging. Shared finances, shared routines, shared long-term expectations. For some minds, that feels grounding. For others, it feels constricting. Not because they don't love, but because they don't want their identity permanently intertwined with a system that limits exit. Another major psychological factor is observational learning. Many people who don't want to get married didn't grow up dreaming of weddings. They grew up watching marriages. They watched quiet resentment build. They watched emotional neglect normalized. They watched people stay together out of obligation, fear, or social pressure. They saw how forever slowly became endure, and their brain learned a lesson, not consciously, subconsciously. Love doesn't always protect freedom. Marriage doesn't always protect intimacy. So instead of idealizing the institution, they learn to separate love from legality. This doesn't make them cynical, it makes them realistic. Another misunderstood trait is emotional self-sufficiency. People who don't want to get married are often emotionally independent. They regulate their own emotions well. They enjoy solitude. They don't panic at silence. This isn't avoidance, it's comfort with self. Marriage often assumes interdependence, two people leaning on each other constantly. For some, that feels nurturing. For others, it feels destabilizing. They don't want to be someone's emotional infrastructure, and they don't want someone to become theirs. Not because they don't care, but because they've learned that dependency can quietly turn into resentment. Another deep layer is fear of identity erosion. Marriage often comes with expectations, social roles, gender roles, family roles, cultural scripts. People who don't want to get married are often highly sensitive to identity drift. They've worked hard to become who they are. They don't want to slowly disappear into a role they didn't consciously choose. This is especially common among people who grew up needing to adapt to others early in life. They learn to merge to survive. So as adults, they guard autonomy fiercely. Marriage, even when healthy, can feel like a return to self-erasure. Another important factor is control over time. Marriage changes how time is negotiated. Holidays, weekends, life decisions. For people who deeply value freedom over their schedule and priorities, this feels costly. Not wrong, costly. They don't want to explain every choice. They don't want to negotiate existence. They want companionship without bureaucracy. Another psychological reality is that love and marriage are no longer inseparable. Previous generations were raised to believe love must lead to marriage. Modern individuals are exposed to alternatives: long-term partnerships without marriage, living apart together, intentional singlehood. People who don't want to get married often separate commitment from ceremony. They can love deeply without needing institutional validation. This doesn't make their love weaker. It often makes it more intentional, because it's chosen daily, not enforced structurally. Another major influence is risk assessment. Marriage is not emotionally neutral. It's legally binding, financially complex, socially entangling. People who don't want to get married often think in long timelines. They ask, what happens if this changes? What happens if we grow differently? What happens if love fades but obligation remains? They're not pessimistic, they're strategic. They don't want love to become a legal trap. They'd rather leave a relationship because it ends naturally than stay because it's difficult to leave. Another common misconception is fear of commitment. In reality, many people who don't want to get married are extremely committed to their work, to friendships, to values, to personal growth. They just don't see marriage as the highest expression of commitment. They see it as one option among many. Another psychological layer is discomfort with performance. Weddings are public, marriage is public, social expectations follow. For people who dislike performative life milestones, this feels unnatural. They don't want their relationship evaluated, celebrated, or monitored. They want intimacy without audience. Another subtle factor is attachment style. People with secure attachment may or may not want marriage, but people with avoidant or highly autonomous attachment styles often feel overwhelmed by permanence. Not because they don't feel love, but because they associate closeness with loss of control. They want closeness with space. Marriage often promises closeness without exit. That imbalance feels threatening to their nervous system. There's also the role of existential honesty. Some people simply don't believe any feeling is permanent. They don't believe in forever as a guarantee. They believe in now, and for them, promising permanence feels dishonest. They'd rather say, "I choose you today," than promise something they can't control. That isn't shallow, it's honest. Another factor is prioritization of personal meaning. Some people build meaning through family structures, others through creativity, exploration, contribution, or solitude. Marriage isn't central to their sense of purpose, and forcing it would feel like living someone else's life. One of the hardest parts for people who don't want to get married is social misunderstanding. They're often told, "You'll regret it, you're running away, you're selfish, you'll end up alone." But loneliness and solitude are not the same. Many people who don't want to get married are deeply connected. They have rich friendships, chosen families, meaningful bonds. They're not anti-love, they're anti-default. They don't want a life just because it's expected. They want a life because it fits. And that's the core psychology. People who don't want to get married are not broken. They are responding to what they've seen, to what they value, to how their mind and nervous system work. Marriage works beautifully for some people and feels suffocating to others. Both truths can exist. If you don't want to get married and have ever felt misunderstood, there's nothing wrong with you. Your preferences are information. Your hesitation is data. Your clarity is intelligence. And if you do want marriage, understanding this psychology doesn't invalidate your desire. It expands empathy. Because fulfillment doesn't come from following a script. It comes from choosing a structure that actually fits who you are. Some people build a life through partnership, some through independence, some through both. None of them are wrong. They're just different ways of being human.